Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going deep on the Miranda warning. Our source is a true crime podcast episode. And let me tell you, this isn't just some boring legal history. This is a real-life crime drama with twists and turns you won't believe.
The Miranda case is really something. It started with one event and ended up changing the whole U.S. justice system.
Okay, so picture this. It's March 1963 in Phoenix, Arizona. A young woman named Patricia is attacked. She gives the police a description of her attacker and his car. But the thing is, the description is pretty vague.
That's actually really common even in serious crimes. Trauma can really affect someone's memory and perception, Makes it tough for investigators to find solid leads.
Right, at first the police are struggling. But then things change. Patricia spots a similar car a few days later, and this is important, she writes down part of the license plate number.
That little detail turned the whole case around. It shows how important it is to pay attention even when you're going through something awful. You never know what information might be the key.
Totally. So the police track down the car's owner, a man named Ernesto Miranda. And guess what? He's got a criminal record. So right away, the investigators are suspicious.
A background check is standard procedure, but it's important to remember that a record doesn't make someone guilty of a new crime. It's just one piece of the puzzle, and investigators can't jump to conclusions.
Now, this is where things get interesting. Miranda agrees to go to the police station for questioning. But here's the thing, he wasn't officially under arrest at this point.
That's important because it brings up the idea of coercion. Even though Miranda wasn't technically arrested, he might not have felt like he could leave, especially with his past and all.
Right, so they put Miranda in a couple of lineups. Both victims kind of point him out, but it's not a sure thing, not a confident ID.
Witness identification. In movies and TV, it seems foolproof, but actually it can be really unreliable. There are so many things that can change a witness's memory. It's a big problem in legal cases.
So the police question Miranda for 2 hours. And you know what? He confesses in writing. Now, before we go on, I want to ask you a question. At this point, do you see any red flags? What do you think about how things have gone so far?
It's a good time to stop and think. We've seen how the investigation happened, and now we're at a turning point. It's time to think about if the process was fair and if Miranda's rights were being protected.
Okay, here's the big reveal.
Ugh.
Miranda was never told about his right to remain silent or his right to a lawyer.
And that's where the Fifth and Sixth Amendments come in. The Fifth Amendment says you don't have to testify against yourself. That's the right to remain silent. And the Sixth Amendment says everyone has the right to a lawyer.
Miranda goes to trial, and his lawyers say his confession shouldn't count because he didn't know his rights. But the court disagrees at first.
The case was about way more than just whether Miranda was guilty. It was about the U.S. justice system. Were Miranda's rights violated? And if so, what does that mean for other cases? What does it mean for the whole system?
Exactly. And it didn't end there. Miranda and his team appealed the decision. Then the ACLU got involved and brought in some of the best lawyers in the country. And eventually the case went all the way to the Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court only takes a tiny number of cases each year. Some reports even say that Miranda's case was chosen partly because of alphabetical order. Crazy, right? It just goes to show that sometimes little things can affect big events.
Wow, that's wild. So this case from Phoenix ends up in the highest court, partly because of where Miranda's name is in the alphabet.
Talk about a twist of fate. But really what mattered was the case itself. And in a close decision 5-4, the Supreme Court ruled for Miranda. It was a huge decision that changed legal history.
A 5-4 decision. That's so close. It shows how complex this issue was, even for the top judges in the country.
Definitely not an easy case. Here's something the court said in their opinion. Without proper safeguards, the process of in-custody interrogation of persons suspected or accused of crime contains inherently compelling pressures which work to undermine the individual's will to resist and to compel him to speak where he would not otherwise do so freely. They knew that police questioning can put a ton of pressure on people.
And that's how we got the Miranda warning. You know, the one we've all heard? You have the right to remain silent.
It's become such a well-known part of our legal system. It's even in our culture. But there's a lot more to it than just those words.
Right. There's a lot to unpack here. So even though he won this big case, Miranda was retried. And this time, his wife's words were a big part of why he was convicted. While he was in prison after the first trial, he confessed to his wife.
That changes things, doesn't it? Now we have to think about a wife testifying the limits of the Miranda ruling and the fact that even with rules, justice isn't always easy or clear.
It shows how one case can have so many unexpected consequences and bring up questions that are still debated today.
The law is always changing. It's shaped by what people think is right, how the law is interpreted, and the cases that come up.
It's amazing how one case can have so many twists and turns and make us think about the whole legal system. And, there are a lot of misunderstandings about Miranda rights. What are some of the most common ones?
You're right, there are tons of myths about the Miranda warning. A big one is the timing. People think the police have to read you your rights as soon as they arrest you, but that's not always true.
Wait, really? I always thought handcuffs equal Miranda time.
That's what we see in movies and on TV, but it's not the whole story. The Miranda warning is only needed when someone is in custody and being questioned about a crime. Just getting arrested doesn't mean you automatically get a Miranda warning.
So you can be arrested and not Mirandized.
Yeah. They can arrest you if they have a good reason to think you committed a crime. That's probable cause. But they only have to Mirandize you if they want to ask you questions about that crime while you're in custody.
So it's about the questioning, not just being arrested. What about simple questions like your name and address? Do they have to give you a Miranda warning for that?
No, those basic questions are fine. They don't need a Miranda warning. They can ask for your name, address, birthday, things like that. It's just part of the process.
Okay, that makes sense. But let's say they do start asking about a crime and the person doesn't say anything. Does that make them look guilty?
That's another thing people get wrong. In the U.S., you have the right to remain silent. It's your choice, and it can't be used against you. Prosecutors can't say, well, he didn't talk, so you must be hiding something.
That's good to know. It means people can protect themselves. They don't have to incriminate themselves. It's that Fifth Amendment, right? Right.
Absolutely. The Miranda warning is there to make sure people understand their rights so they can make choices even in a tough situation, like a police interview.
It's interesting that this case is still talked about so much. Some people say the Miranda ruling makes it harder for police to do their jobs and solve crimes. What do you think about that?
It's a real concern, and people have talked about it a lot. Some people who don't like the Miranda ruling say it lets criminals just stay quiet because they know what they say can't be used against them. And that might make it hard for the police to get evidence and put people in jail. But others say it's super important to protect innocent people and make sure confessions aren't forced.
So it's like a balancing act between protecting rights and giving law enforcement what they need to keep us safe.
Exactly. It's complicated with good points on both sides. And the debate goes on as people try to figure out the problems with the justice system.
What I find really interesting is how the Miranda warning is everywhere in our culture. It's in movies, TV shows, books, everything. It's like a cultural icon. Do you think that's actually helped people understand their rights?
That's a good question. It's true that pop culture simplifies things sometimes, even gets things wrong about the law. But seeing the Miranda warning so much has probably made people more aware of it, at least a little bit. Whether that makes people feel like they can use those rights in a real situation with the police is another question.
Yeah, it's one thing to see it on a screen and another to actually go through it, especially with all the pressure and stress.
Sure. Police interviews can be really intense. You might know your rights, but when things get tough, you might not be able to think clearly or stand up for yourself.
So what's the lesson here? Does the Miranda case tell us that even with these rules, justice is still messy and not perfect?
I think it shows that even though the legal system wants to be fair, it's run by people. And people make mistakes. Things aren't always consistent. And the way we see things changes over time. It's not a perfect system, and the Miranda case points that out.
Speaking of messy, let's talk about Miranda himself. After the second trial, he went back to prison, but then he got out on parole. And then, get this, he started signing Miranda cards and selling them.
I know, right? Like something out of Hollywood. He made money from being famous for this case.
He became a symbol of his own story. And talk about owning your past. But sadly, things took a dark turn. What happened to Miranda in the end?
It's almost hard to believe. In 1976, he was in a bar fight and someone stabbed him. He died. And the crazy part is the guy who was arrested for killing him was read his Miranda rights.
Wow, talk about coming full circle. Life is so strange. Sometimes legal history and what happens to people in their lives cross paths in weird ways.
It shows that you never know what's going to happen. And sometimes even the best laws can't protect us from the crazy things people do.
You're right. So we've talked about the whole story of the Miranda warning, how it affects trials, the arguments about it, and what happened to Ernesto Miranda. It's a wild story, isn't it? Full of drama and, tragedy. But what gets me is how important this case still is. It affects how we think about law even today.
The Miranda case really showed everyone the problem with trying to have good law enforcement and also protect individual rights. It's something the justice system is always working on.
Now that we've heard all this, I have a question for you listening. Would knowing your Miranda rights really change what you would do if the police were questioning you? It's easy to say we'd stay quiet and, stick to our rights, but if it was really happening, who knows?
It's something to think about for sure. Being questioned by the police can be scary. Even if you know your rights, you might not be able to stay calm or speak up for yourself.
It makes you realize how complex the legal system is
Hmm.
and how hard it is to be fair to everyone.
The Miranda case proves that laws change. They're alive. What we think is right changes how we understand the law changes, and new situations come up. It's an invitation to look at other big Supreme Court cases and see how they made the law what it is today.
That's a great point. Laws aren't set in stone. They change as we change. Well, that's it for our deep dive into the Miranda warning. I hope you learned something new about this important case, how complicated it is, and what it means for us today.
It's a story that reminds us that justice is something we're always working towards. And it reminds us to keep learning about the law and how it affects us all.
Thanks for listening. See you next time. And until then, keep learning and stay curious.